The date was March 7, 2014, and to the crew of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370, it seemed like just another routine flight. The Boeing 777 had taken off from Kuala Lumpur International Airport at 12:41 a.m. local time, carrying 227 passengers and 12 crew members. Their destination was Beijing Capital International Airport, a trip lasting just over 5 hours. But Flight 370 would never arrive at its destination. Just over an hour after departure, air traffic controllers lost contact with the aircraft. It had been cruising steadily over the Gulf of Thailand, and then suddenly, all communication ceased. The plane disappeared from radar screens, vanishing into the night sky. An emergency was declared, and search and rescue efforts began immediately, but it quickly became apparent that something was wrong. No mayday call had been received from the pilots. The plane had not reported any technical problems or difficulties. It had simply vanished without a trace, along with all 239 souls on board. This began one of the largest multinational search efforts in history, spanning thousands of miles. But remarkably, not a single piece of debris from the missing plane was found. How could a massive Boeing 777 just disappear? How could no trace of it be found? The mystery confounded experts and aviation authorities. There were simply more questions than answers. Had there been a sudden catastrophic mechanical failure? Had the pilots become incapacitated? Or was there a more sinister explanation? As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, without any sign of the wreckage, the disappearance of Flight 370 became one of the biggest aviation mysteries of all time. Loved ones of those on board were left in anguish, desperate for answers that never came. The lack of closure compounded the grief and trauma. Eventually, the search efforts were called off, unable to provide definitive evidence of the plane's fate. But the questions lingered. How does an airplane just vanish? What happened in the skies over the Gulf of Thailand that night? The disappearance of Flight 370 has puzzled the world for years and remains a mystery to this day. This tragic event will be explored in detail through the upcoming chapters, chronicling the ongoing quest to uncover the elusive truth of what happened to those 239 lost souls. Chapter 1. A routine departure. As Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 prepared for departure, the 227 passengers were unaware of their fate. At the gate, travelers of various nationalities queued up to board the awaiting Boeing 777. Among them were families, couples, students, and business people. Ordinary people embarking on an ordinary trip. The experienced pilots and crew carried out their usual pre-flight routines without issue. The captain, a veteran aviator, completed his inspection of the aircraft. The first officer, completing his transition training on this model, inputted the flight plan as the passengers settled into their seats. At 12:41 a.m. local time, with boarding completed and safety checks done, the massive jetliner pushed back from the gate and taxied towards the runway. Clearance was given for takeoff into the night sky. The plane lifted gracefully upwards, the lights of Kuala Lumpur Airport fading from view below. Climbing smoothly to cruising altitude, there was no indication to the crew or passengers of the events about to unfold. As far as anyone could tell, this was a perfectly routine flight heading steadily towards Beijing. But in under 2 hours, their aircraft would vanish without a trace into the darkness, commencing one of the most perplexing mysteries in aviation history. Chapter 2. Communications cease. Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 reached its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet approximately 1 hour after departing Kuala Lumpur International Airport. At 1:01 a.m. local time, The flight crew reported reaching the assigned cruise level to air traffic control, all normal procedures so far. The Boeing 777 continued on course, heading northeast over the Gulf of Thailand. On the ground, air traffic controllers monitored the flight's progress, tracking it on radar as they managed an uneventful night of air traffic. On board, passengers slept soundly or watched movies, unaware of their dwindling time left in the air. At 1:19 a.m., the voice of the captain sounded over the radio, confirming a frequency change to controllers as Flight 370 passed from Malaysian to Vietnamese airspace. This handoff was the last routine communication received from the doomed aircraft. Around 1:30 a.m., controllers in Ho Chi Minh City attempted standard contact with Flight 370 to relay radar details. Strangely, there was no response over the radio, just static. Growing concerned, they contacted Malaysia for help raising the silent jetliner, but neither could successfully hail the plane. The alarms spread as it became clear something was very wrong. Why wasn't anyone answering the urgent calls? Where exactly was the plane now? Controllers scrambled to locate the suddenly silent aircraft, hoping against hope the pilots would somehow re-establish contact. But radar data soon revealed a terrifying truth. The plane had inexplicably changed direction and was now flying back over peninsular Malaysia. The realization dawned that this was no ordinary emergency. With its communication systems mysteriously dark for an unknown reason, Flight 370 had gone rogue, and there was no way to determine what was transpiring on board. One can only imagine the outright panic and confusion in the darkened passenger cabin as the plane turned around without explanation. Phones would have been useless at cruising altitude, severing all contact with loved ones below. The passengers were trapped, at the mercy of whatever was happening in the cockpit. Fear and dread surely mounted in those poor souls as the minutes stretched on endlessly. On the ground, search and rescue teams raced urgently to find the aircraft based on its last known position over the Gulf of Thailand. But their efforts would prove futile. In a scenario that seemed unthinkable, Malaysia Airlines Flight 370, along with the 239 people on board, had vanished without a trace in mid-flight, cutting off communications and disappearing into the night. The unfolding mystery would launch one of the largest multinational search efforts in history, all to ultimately uncover the truth of what happened that fateful morning. Chapter 3. Tracking efforts begin. After Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 vanished, a monumental multinational rescue operation commenced. Aircraft from Malaysia, Singapore, Vietnam, China, and the United States were hastily deployed to search the Gulf of Thailand near the plane's last known position. Ships in the area were redirected to scan the seas for any signs of the missing wide-body jetliner and its 239 passengers and crew. Back on land, aviation authorities worked urgently to analyze radar data, trying to pinpoint the aircraft's location when it disappeared in hopes of narrowing the search zone. Satellite images were scrutinized for any specks of debris or oil slicks. Distress frequencies were monitored round the clock for a mayday call that never came. But despite intensive sweeping of the last known flight path, not a single piece of wreckage was found. The Boeing 777, along with all souls on board, had vanished without leaving a tangible trace. It was as if the massive jet had simply evaporated into thin air. As the search hours turned into days, the operation took on new urgency. Analysis of the flight's electronic systems eventually indicated that after its communications blackout, Flight 370 had radically changed course doubling back on itself toward the Strait of Malacca. This meant that instead of a confined area in the Gulf of Thailand, the search zone now spanned hundreds of thousands of square miles in the remote southern Indian Ocean, where currents could have carried floating debris great distances. The monumental nature of hunting for wreckage across such a vast and remote expanse soon became tragically clear. Any remnants of the downed flight could drift for weeks in the open seas largely unnoticed. Without more data to narrow the search area, locating the lost aircraft needle in a haystack task. The hope of finding survivors steadily faded with each passing day. Loved ones of those on board could only watch and wait in agony, clinging to optimism that was slow to fade. But authorities were at a loss. With so little evidence, how does one find a missing plane with more than 200 souls that seem to have disappeared without a trace? As the search dragged on unsuccessfully for years, becoming the most expensive in aviation history, more questions than answers surrounded the fate of Flight 370. Though some confirmed debris washed ashore later, it was too little to solve the mystery. The lives lost that day appeared destined to remain unfound, taking their secrets into the vast depths of the remote oceans. Chapter 4. Piecing together the evidence. With the search for Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 proving fruitless, investigators turned to analyzing the scarce data available in the hope of divining some clue to the aircraft's fate. Detailed information about the plane itself, including maintenance records and system specifics, were thoroughly examined. However, no anomalies were found that could have caused or contributed to the jet's disappearance. The crew's background, training, and mental health were also scrutinized, but neither the captain nor co-pilot showed any red flags. Both were highly experienced aviators with no known personal issues. Attention shifted to the flight path and aircraft performance derived from radar plots. The sudden turn implied deliberate action, yet mechanical failure remained unlikely, given the jet seemed to be fully in control. Growing evidence pointed to human intervention, not technical fault, but speculating on a hijacking scenario using so little information seemed ill-advised. The truth still eluded authorities. One intriguing data source was a series of hourly handshakes between the plane and a satellite, which placed the vanished jet along one of several broad corridors. However, the capricious nature of such limited satellite pings made definitive tracking impossible. As scant new debris washed up on remote beaches, it provided another modest clue that the plane had indeed gone down somewhere in the vast Indian Ocean. But the evidence remained too scarce to locate the main wreckage. Absent more tangible leads, the full truth of Flight 370's fate seemed destined to remain concealed forever beneath the waves. For the victims' families, the lack of answers compounded their grief. But authorities pledged to keep analyzing what little data existed in hopes of one day still unraveling the mystery. Chapter 5. Hypothesizing the human element. With no clear mechanical failure identified, attention shifted to the human elements aboard Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 as possibly holding clues to its baffling disappearance, but deriving the motivations and actions of those lost souls from the scarce evidence available proved a major challenge for investigators. The captain had an extensive background check run, revealing a stable family life and finances. A review of his training records showed a seasoned aviator with over 18,000 flight hours. Yet his home-built flight simulator, erased just weeks prior, still intrigued authorities when recovered data hinted at simulated landings in the remote southern Indian Ocean. The co-pilot's profile showed a typical 27-year-old starting an aviation career. He had trained for this Boeing 777 flight and was described as kind by peers, with no known radical views. Interviews with the other crew, ground staff, and airline officials painted a picture of professionals carrying out their jobs as usual. On the passenger manifest, 2 individuals with stolen passports drew scrutiny, but were eventually deemed unlikely to be terrorists. With no claim of responsibility, no clear motive, and no evidence of criminality in their backgrounds, speculating on a hijacker scenario amounted to guesswork absent further facts. Those lost souls seemed to hold their secrets eternally. Yet while identifying a perpetrator might prove impossible, investigators knew someone must be held accountable for the tragedy. Even without the pilot's testimony or the jet's flight data recorders, the quest for justice drove them to keep seeking answers using the limited data available. Some experts clung to the hope that new underwater search technology could someday detect the main wreckage, which surely would contain definitive clues locked away in the jet's missing black boxes. But until the final resting place of the Boeing 777 was found, the truth lingered out of reach, vexingly close, yet invisible below the waves. For the families of the 227 passengers and 12 crew lost that day, the lack of closure added to their everlasting grief. 10 years later, their longing for answers remains poignantly unfulfilled. But the memories of those innocent souls drive the lingering hope that the disappearance of Flight 370 will not remain an eternal mystery, and that someday the truth will finally be unearthed. Chapter 6. Ongoing Impact and Final Reflections. The baffling disappearance of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 on March 8, 2014, stands as one of the most confounding mysteries in modern aviation. A decade later, its sobering ripple effects continue to profoundly impact the airline industry, the countless lives upended, and the global consciousness. In the years since, implemented changes aimed at preventing such ghost flights show the indelible mark left by this tragedy. Aircraft tracking protocols now utilize more robust real-time data streaming, extended battery life for black boxes, upgraded underwater locator beacons, and expanded use of independent surveillance solutions. Yet for the hundreds of loved ones left behind, the lack of answers or closure remains a devastating open wound, even as time marches forward. Bereavement support groups have provided immeasurable comfort, bonding together families from across the globe united in their grieving. Still, the agony of not knowing persists unrelentingly. Tireless online communities of victims' families, aviation experts, and armchair investigators work to keep the loss felt sharp. Their advocacy keeps public attention and political pressure focused on continuing the underwater search efforts. Their memories honor those lost while holding out hope the puzzle may someday finally be solved. 10 years on, progress has slowed, but the probe endures as authorities re-examine evidence, hoping new analysis techniques might extract fresh clues. From the seabed to academia to amateur sleuths, enduring belief remains that the key to solving this coldest of cases still lingers out there somewhere, waiting to be found. Those most deeply impacted have channeled unthinkable pain into purpose, working to improve aviation safety and comfort others through advocacy and education. Out of the darkness, light is found, meaning cavied from tragedy. And while the full truth may continue eluding use for now, The belief persists that one day this disappearance will give up its final secrets and bring understanding to those who still mourn today. The ongoing impact underscores our fragility and transience, but also the remarkable resilience of the human spirit. This confounding event has forever reshaped our collective memory, reminding us that even when bewildering suffering transcends understanding, we must carry on, holding fast to faith, hope, and love's bond, which time can never sever. The unsolved disappearance of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 on March 8, 2014 stands as one of the most confounding mysteries in modern aviation history. Now, over a decade later, its sobering ripple effects continue to profoundly impact the airline industry. The countless lives shattered, and the global consciousness. In the years since this tragedy, several key changes have aimed to prevent such ghost flights in the future and improve location tracking when aircraft go missing. Aircraft tracking protocols now utilize more robust real-time data streaming to ground stations, providing greater insight into off-course deviations. Black box battery life has been extended to allow underwater pinging for longer, and underwater locator beacons have been upgraded to transmit more accurately when submerged. Independent surveillance solutions like constant data live streaming have also been explored to supplement traditional radars. The International Civil Aviation Organization called for the formation of a task force to develop new aircraft tracking standards in the wake of this disaster. As a result, the Global Aeronautical Distress and Safety System was established, which now requires airlines to automatically track aircraft positions at least once every 15 minutes when operating over oceans. The enhanced tracking capabilities provide authorities with far better data when responding to distressed aircraft situations. Cockpit procedures were also re-examined to determine opportunities for improvement. Aviation agencies called for increased random drug and alcohol testing of flight crews to detect pilot impairment issues early. Cockpit access controls were strengthened, with procedures revised to ensure unauthorized personnel cannot access the flight deck during critical phases. While tremendous progress has been made, the ripple effects of this tragedy still profoundly impact the hundreds of loved ones left behind. The lack of answers or closure remains a devastating open wound even as time marches forward. Tireless online communities of victims' families, aviation experts, and armchair investigators continue to advocate for continuing search efforts, intent on one day solving the lingering mystery. And so the search carries on, driven by the belief that the key still awaits discovery somewhere. Advancements in analysis techniques, deep-sea scanning technologies, or debris drift tracking may yet illuminate the fate of those lost souls. Until then, hope endures that the disappeared Flight 370 will still surrender its secrets to finally bring understanding and closure